Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story. Tonight, imagine a winding forest road beneath towering oaks, the air cool with the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Somewhere ahead, a lone traveler walks beneath swaying branches, carrying little more than a weathered lute, a patched cloak, and enough confidence to survive on applause and luck, which, as it turns out, is a surprisingly risky business model. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. IT's always fascinating to imagine listeners scattered across distant towns and quiet corners of the world, all gathering for the same tale. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a wandering bard named Aldrich, a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. He traveled the roads surrounding Elderwood, moving between villages like a drifting leaf carried by the wind. 1 month, he might be singing in a bustling market square. The next, he might be sharing supper with shepherds on a lonely hillside. Aldrich possessed a talent that often proved useful. He could convince nearly anyone that he knew exactly what he was doing. The fact that he rarely knew what he was doing remained a separate issue. One autumn evening, as golden leaves scattered across a woodland path, Aldrich followed a narrow road toward a village whose name he had already forgotten twice that day. His lute bounced gently against his back. The sky glowed orange behind distant hills. A flock of birds crossed overhead. Everything felt peaceful. Naturally, that was when trouble appeared. Trouble often preferred dramatic timing. The trouble arrived in the form of an elderly merchant driving a cart loaded with barrels. The merchant stood beside a broken wheel, muttering colorful complaints toward the heavens. Aldrich approached with a friendly smile. "Need assistance?" he asked. The merchant examined him. "You look like a musician." "I am." "Can you repair a wheel? Nitrogen monoxide?" The merchant sighed. "Then you're exactly as useful as you appear." Aldrich nodded. An entirely fair observation. Still, the bard helped lift supplies while the merchant worked. As twilight settled over the road, they shared bread beside the cart. The merchant introduced himself as Garon, a man with a gray beard, tired eyes, and an endless collection of opinions. Most of those opinions were negative, especially concerning roads and weather and taxes and geese, particularly geese. Aldrich never learned why. During their meal, Garon mentioned something unusual. It happened almost by accident. The merchant had been describing a recent journey through distant territories. Most of the stories involved rain, an impressive amount of rain. Then his voice lowered slightly. "I heard something strange near Blackwater Crossing." Aldrich glanced up. "Strange how?" Garon poked the fire. "You ever hear of the Forgotten Melody?" The bard frowned. "No, most haven't." That immediately captured Aldrich's attention. Bards loved discovering stories unknown to other bards. IT was almost a professional requirement. Garon continued. "Some say there's an ancient song hidden somewhere beyond Elderwood." "A song?" "Not just any song." The merchant leaned closer. "A melody so old nobody remembers who composed it." Aldrich smiled. "That sounds impossible, probably. But," Garon shrugged, "but people keep talking about it." The fire crackled softly. The forest grew darker around them. A cool breeze drifted through the trees. According to rumor, Garin explained, fragments of the melody had appeared throughout the kingdom for centuries. Different travelers claimed to know. Pieces of it. Monks wrote about it. Minstrels searched for it. Scholars argued over it. Nobody ever found the complete version, and yet the stories never disappeared. Some believed the melody revealed hidden truths. Others claimed it could reshape destiny. One particularly enthusiastic fisherman apparently insisted it improved the flavor of cabbage. Nobody took that theory seriously, not even the fisherman. Aldrich chuckled, yet something about the story lingered in his mind. Perhaps it was the mystery. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was because wandering bards have an almost supernatural inability to ignore interesting rumors. A fascinating distraction was more irresistible than gold. The conversation continued late into the evening. Eventually the merchant fell asleep. The fire burned low. Stars appeared above the treetops. Aldrich remained awake. His gaze drifted upward. The sky looked vast and endless, a sea of glittering lights stretching beyond imagination. For a long while he listened to the quiet sounds of the forest. WLS calling, branches creaking, leaves whispering. Then he heard something unexpected. A faint melody, soft, distant, barely audible. At first, he thought it was the wind. The notes seemed to drift through the darkness, gentle and haunting, not loud enough to identify, not clear enough to follow, just enough to notice. Aldrich sat upright. The sound vanished. He waited. Silence. Only forest. Noises remained. The bard rubbed his eyes. Perhaps he had imagined it. That seemed likely. After all, he had spent the evening discussing mysterious songs. The human mind enjoyed playing tricks, especially at night, especially after listening to a merchant complain about geese for nearly 2 hours. Still, the feeling remained. Something had changed. Some invisible thread had tightened. Somewhere beyond sight, the next morning dawned bright and crisp. Mist clung to the ground. Sunlight filtered through branches. Birdsong filled the woods. Garin repaired the wheel. The merchant prepared to continue west. Aldrich should have continued south. That had been his original plan. A perfectly reasonable plan. The sort of plan sensible people followed. Unfortunately, curiosity had arrived, and curiosity was rarely sensible. As they packed supplies, Garin noticed the bard staring toward the northern forest. "You look troubled." "I'm thinking. Dangerous habit." Aldrich laughed. "You mentioned Blackwater Crossing." "I did." "Where exactly is it?" The merchant froze, then slowly smiled. It was the smile of a man recognizing a mistake he could nitrogen monoxide longer undo. "Oh, nitrogen monoxide." "What? You caught the adventure." "The adventure?" Look." Garin pointed accusingly. "I've seen it before." "What look?" "The look people get before making very questionable decisions." Aldrich grinned. "You're exaggerating." "Am I?" The merchant folded his arms. "Yesterday you were traveling south." "True." "Today you're planning to chase a story, possibly, into unknown territory." "Maybe, based entirely on rumors." Aldrich considered. "That does sound slightly concerning." The merchant sighed heavily, then handed him a small map. "Take this." "You had a map all along? I wasn't hiding it?" "You literally kept it in your coat. That's where maps go." Feir Point. Aldrich accepted the map. The road ahead suddenly seemed different, larger, full of possibilities. The forgotten melody might be real, or it might be nonsense. Either way, he wanted answers. And so, as morning sunlight spread across the forest, the wandering bard adjusted Hi's lute, secured his cloak, and turned away from the path he had intended to follow. He stepped toward the unknown, toward distant valleys, toward forgotten stories, toward mysteries buried beneath centuries of rumor. And somewhere far beyond, the trees of Elderwood, waiting silently beyond the horizon, the first clues to an ancient melody were already beginning to stir. Morning sunlight stretched across the northern road as Aldrich left the familiar paths behind. The forest gradually thinned. Ancient oaks gave way to rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed like green waves beneath the breeze. The world seemed larger here, less traveled, less certain. A place where roads wandered almost as much as the people using them. Aldrich followed the map Garon had given him. At least he attempted to. Maps, he often believed, were less instructions and more strongly worded suggestions. Several hours into his journey, he discovered he had somehow taken a shepherd's trail instead of the main road. This realization occurred when he found himself standing in the middle of a field surrounded by sheep. Dozens of sheep. Every single one staring at him. Aldrich stared back. Nobody moved. It felt strangely political. Finally, one sheep sneezed. The tension broke. A nearby shepherd laughed so hard he nearly fell from a fence. The shepherd introduced himself as Bren, a broad-shouldered young man whose life seemed wonderfully uncomplicated. He spent his days tending sheep. He spent his evenings tending sheep, and occasionally, for variety, he thought about sheep. After helping Aldrich return to the correct road, Bren shared a midday meal of bread and cheese beneath a large ash tree. As travelers often did, they exchanged stories. Aldrich performed a lively tune on his lute. The shepherd applauded enthusiastically, though one sheep appeared deeply unimpressed. Aldrich chose not to take it personally. During their conversation, the bard casually mentioned the forgotten melody. To his surprise, Bren recognized the name. Not much, but enough. My grandfather spoke about it, the shepherd sighed. Aldrich immediately leaned forward. What did he say? Bren scratched his beard. He always claimed pieces of the song were hidden inside old stories. Stories? Legends, folk-tales, strange little sayings. Aldrich frowned. That seemed oddly specific. Did he ever explain WHY? The shepherd shrugged. He sighed, songs are easier to hide than treasure. How so? Bren smiled. Everyone searches for gold. Aldrich considered that. It sounded exactly like the sort of wisdom elderly people enjoyed sharing shortly, before wandering away mysteriously. His own grandfather had once spent 3 days teaching him life lessons through turnip metaphors. Aldrich still wasn't entirely certain what any of them meant. After lunch, the bard continued north. The road descended into a wide valley draped in morning mist. Streams crossed the landscape. Wildflowers covered distant slopes. Small farmhouses dotted the hillsides. The scenery felt peaceful enough to lull travelers into forgetting how enormous the world truly was. As afternoon approached, Aldrich reached a roadside shrine built from weathered stone. It stood alone beside a spring. Simple, quiet, ancient. Someone had recently left fresh flowers there. Nearby sat an elderly woman wrapped in a faded blue cloak. She hummed softly while collecting herbs. The melody caught Aldrich's attention, not because he recognized IT, because he almost recognized IT. The tune felt strangely familiar, like a memory sitting just beyond reach. The bard approached politely. "That's a beautiful song." The woman smiled. "Is IT? I think so." "Good." She continued gathering herbs. Aldrich waited. Eventually she glanced up. "You want something. Was it that obvious? You're a bard?" "Fair observation." He sat beside the spring. The woman introduced herself as Malin. She lived nearby and knew more local tales than most village storytellers. When Aldrich mentioned the forgotten melody, her expression changed. Only slightly, but enough to notice. "You've heard of IT?" he asked. "I've heard many things." That's not an answer. IT wasn't meant to be. Aldrich sighed. This was becoming a pattern. Everyone seemed determined to communicate through riddles. Malin laughed softly. Then she told him something peculiar. Long ago, she explained, travelers crossing these valleys spoke of certain songs that seemed to appear repeatedly in different places. Fragments, tiny pieces, never complete. A verse here, a melody there, a line remembered by a farmer, a tune preserved by fishermen, scattered across generations, as though someone had deliberately broken a larger song into countless smaller pieces. Aldrich listened carefully. The theory sounded improbable, which made it all the more interesting. The woman eventually pointed toward distant mountains barely visible on the horizon. "Follow the river east for several days." WHY? People gather there. What people? Travelers. That answer immediately interested him. Travelers collected stories, stories collected clues, and clues, he hoped, might eventually reveal the truth. Before leaving, Malin shared an unusual historical curiosity. Centuries earlier, certain kingdoms employed official memory singers. Their duty was to preserve important events through music. Entire battles, treaties, family histories, all carried through generations in song. Written records could burn. Songs survived. Aldrich found the idea fascinating. A melody could become a library. A tune could preserve a lifetime. As evening approached, he followed the river eastward. The valley narrowed. Steep hills rose around him. The air smelled of pine and damp stone. Somewhere overhead, hawks circled silently. The road grew quieter. Hours passed. Then twilight arrived. The sky deepened into shades of purple and gold. Long shadows stretched across the landscape. Aldrich eventually spotted a small traveler's camp near the riverbank. 3 wagons stood in a circle. A fire crackled at the center. Several merchants sat around IT sharing supper. The bard received a warm welcome. Travelers often appreciated musicians, especially musicians willing to perform before requesting food. A fair arrangement. Soon Aldrich sat beside the fire with a bowl of stew. The meal tasted excellent. Or perhaps he was simply hungry enough to believe it tasted excellent. Either way, nobody complained. As darkness settled around the camp, stories began to flow. One merchant described a haunted bridge. Another insisted he'd seen a fox steal an entire roasted chicken. A third claimed he once sold boots to a duke who turned out not to be a duke. That story became significantly less impressive after further explanation. Eventually, conversation shifted toward local legends. Aldrich seized the opportunity. The forgotten melody. He sighed casually. Several travelers exchanged glances. That reaction immediately caught his attention. One elderly trader spoke first. "I heard part of IT once." The fire seemed quieter. Everyone listened. Aldrich leaned forward. "Really?" The man nodded. "At least I think I did. WHERE, many years ago." Not helpful. The trader stared into the flames. There was a singer in a village near Blackwater Crossing. Aldrich's pulse quickened. The place Guerin mentioned. The trader nodded. The singer knew an old tune. "What happened?" The man's expression grew thoughtful. He claimed the melody wasn't meant to be heard all at once. Aldrich frowned. "What does that mean?" "No idea." The merchant shrugged. He disappeared before anyone could ask. Silence followed. The fire crackled softly. River water flowed nearby. Night insects sang from the grass. Aldrich stared into the flames. Every clue seemed to create 3 new mysteries. Yet instead of discouraging him, the uncertainty only deepened his curiosity. The forgotten melody, nitrogen monoxide, longer felt like a simple legend. Too many people knew fragments. Too many stories pointed towards something real. Perhaps not magical, perhaps not world-changing, but real. Somewhere beyond these valleys, beyond the rivers and hills, beyond Blackwater Crossing itself, the answers waited. And as stars slowly emerged above the darkened landscape, the wandering bard found himself eager for morning. For the first time in many years, he felt as though he was following a thread woven through history itself, a thread hidden inside songs, inside stories, inside memories, and somewhere ahead, that thread was slowly beginning to pull him toward its source. The next morning arrived wrapped in silver mist. The merchants broke camp before sunrise, their wagons creaking softly as they followed separate roads into the waking countryside. Aldrich traveled alone once more, following the river eastward as Malin had suggested. The land gradually changed. The cheerful farms and open meadows of previous days gave way to quieter territory. Hills rose higher. The forests thickened. Villages became fewer and farther apart. By midday, Aldrich reached a weathered wooden sign. One arrow pointed south. Another pointed east. A third pointed toward a settlement called Brindle Hollow. Someone had carved a frowning face beneath the village name. That was rarely encouraging. Still, curiosity remained undefeated. Aldrich headed toward Brindle Hollow. The village appeared shortly afterward, nestled between low hills and surrounded by old stone walls. Smoke rose from chimneys. Chickens wandered dusty lanes. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then he noticed something strange. Nobody smiled. Not a single person. Villagers carried baskets. They repaired fences. They swept porches. They chatted politely. Yet every face seemed weighed down by an invisible burden. The atmosphere felt oddly muted, like a feast where nobody remembered why they had gathered. Aldrich entered the village square. Several people glanced at him. Most quickly looked away. The bard offered cheerful greetings. Responses ranged from polite nods to expressions suggesting they had recently misplaced something important, perhaps themselves. He found lodging at a small inn near the square and spent the afternoon observing village life. The pattern remained consistent. Nitrogen monoxide laughter, nitrogen monoxide songs, nitrogen monoxide, children playing games, nitrogen monoxide, cheerful arguments over absolutely unimportant topics. Every community possessed those. Entire villages would spend decades debating the proper way to bake bread. Brindle Hollow appeared to debate nothing at all. By evening, Aldrich's curiosity had grown impossible to ignore. He carried his lute into the square and sat beside an old fountain. A few villagers glanced toward him. The bard smiled. Then he began to play. The tune was lively, bright, impossible to mistake for anything except cheerful. The sort of melody that encouraged tapping feet before listeners realized what was happening. Several villages slowed their pace. Others stopped entirely. Children emerged from nearby homes. Faces turned toward the music. Aldrich continued playing. The melody danced through the square, a playful tune full of energy and mischief. Within minutes, something remarkable happened. One child laughed, just once, a tiny burst of sound, but it echoed across the square like a bell. Everyone froze. The child looked surprised. His mother looked even more surprised. Aldrich nearly missed a note. Then another child laughed, and another. Soon smiles appeared, tentative at first, like people rediscovering something they had forgotten existed. The bard finished the song. For a moment, silence lingered. Then a few villagers applauded. The sound felt hesitant, almost unfamiliar, yet genuine. An elderly baker approached him. "I haven't heard laughter in this square for years." Aldrich blinked. "Years?" The baker nodded. The statement attracted several others. Before long, a small crowd gathered around him, and slowly the story emerged. Nearly 20 years earlier, Brindle Hollow had been a lively place. Music filled the streets. Festivals drew visitors from neighboring valleys. The village was famous for celebrations. Then something changed. Nobody could explain exactly what happened. Nitrogen monoxide disaster struck. Nitrogen monoxide war arrived. Nitrogen monoxide plague swept through the settlement. Instead, joy simply faded, little by little, year after year. People still worked, still married, still raised families. Life continued. But laughter became rare. Songs disappeared. Festivals shrank. The village slowly forgot how to celebrate. The explanation sounded impossible, yet the villagers described it with complete sincerity. Aldrich listened carefully. Something felt unusual, not supernatural, just strange, too strange to dismiss. That evening, the baker invited him to supper. Several villagers joined them. They spoke long into the night. Eventually, Aldrich asked an important question. When did this begin? The room grew quiet. People exchanged glances. Finally, an elderly woman answered. "After Rowan left." Who was Rowan? The silence deepened. A man stirred the fire. Someone else looked toward the window. Aldrich immediately recognized the reaction. Every village possessed certain names that carried stories. This was clearly one of them. The elderly woman continued. "Rowan was our storyteller." Storyteller? He knew every legend, every song. Others nodded. The baker smiled faintly. He could make an audience laugh until they cried. Another villager added, "and cry until they laughed." That sounded like a talented storyteller indeed. What happened to him? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the baker sighed. He left? Just left? The villagers nodded. One autumn morning, Rowan packed his belongings and departed. Nitrogen monoxide explanation. Nitrogen monoxide farewell. Nitrogen monoxide promise to return, simply gone. The community never recovered. Aldrich frowned. People missed beloved storytellers, certainly, but this seemed deeper, almost as though Rowan had taken something invisible with him, something larger than stories. The conversation continued until late evening. Before leaving, the elderly woman offered one final detail, a detail that immediately captured Aldrich's attention. Rowan was searching for a song. The room fell silent again. Aldrich felt H.I.'s pulse quicken. What song? The same one you're chasing. The forgotten melody. Of course. The name itself was enough. Several villagers crossed their arms. Others exchanged uneasy looks. Clearly, the legend remained familiar here. According to their memories, Rowan had spent years gathering old tales connected to the melody. He traveled frequently, collected stories, interviewed travelers, studied forgotten songs, then one day he left and never returned. That night Aldrich lay, awake in H.I.'s room. Moonlight filtered through wooden shutters. Outside, the village remained quiet. His thoughts turned endlessly. The forgotten melody appeared. Again, another connection, another missing piece, another person drawn into its orbit. And now a storyteller had vanished while pursuing IT. Coincidence remained possible, but the coincidences were becoming remarkably persistent. The following morning, Aldrich resumed his investigation. Several villagers directed him toward Rowan's abandoned cottage at the edge of town. The small home stood beneath an ancient oak tree, weathered by time, untouched for years. The door creaked open easily. Dust covered nearly everything. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows. Books filled shelves along the walls. Loose pages lay scattered across tables. A lifetime of collected stories surrounded him. Aldrich carefully examined the contents. Most were ordinary folk tales, legends, songs, local histories. Yet among the papers he discovered something unusual. A notebook. Its pages contained observations, written in neat handwriting, references to ancient melodies, fragments of lyrics, notes about travelers, and one repeated phrase, again and again, written in margins, underlined repeatedly. The melody hides inside memory. Aldrich read the lines several times. The melody hides inside memory. What did that mean? He searched the remaining pages. Near the end, he found a final entry. Brief, almost rushed. I was wrong about the stones. The answer lies beyond Blackwater Crossing. That was all. Nitrogen monoxide explanation. Nitrogen monoxide destination. Nitrogen monoxide farewell. Just those words. The answer lies beyond Blackwater Crossing. Aldrich closed the notebook. Outside, wind stirred the branches overhead. Leaves rustled softly. The village remained quiet beyond the cottage walls. For a long moment, he simply sat there, thinking. The journey was growing stranger, the clues increasingly connected, and now he possessed something valuable, not answers, but direction. Sometimes direction mattered more. By afternoon, the bard prepared to leave Brindle Hollow. The villagers gathered to bid him farewell. Their smiles appeared slightly brighter than when he had arrived. A few children even laughed while chasing one another through the square. A small improvement, yet meaningful. As Aldrich departed, the baker called after him, "Find the song." The bard smiled. "I'll try." The baker nodded, then added, "And if you happen to find Rowan, tell him he still owes me 3 silver coins." Aldrich laughed. Some mysteries were ancient and profound. Others involved unpaid bakery debts. Both, apparently, could survive for decades. With Rowan's notebook secured inside his pack, the wandering bard continued east, toward Blackwater Crossing, toward forgotten answers, and toward a mystery that seemed increasingly woven into the lives of everyone who had ever searched for the lost melody. By the time Aldrich reached the old road beyond Brindle Hollow, the sky had softened into late afternoon gold. Rowan's notebook rested inside his pack, wrapped carefully in cloth. It felt heavier than a handful of pages had any right to feel. But mysteries often did that. They sat quietly in a bag, pretending to be harmless, while quietly rearranging a person's entire life. The road curved through rocky hills. Weathered stones stood along the slopes like forgotten sentries. Some were natural, others had clearly been placed there by human hands long ago. Too long ago for anyone nearby to remember why. Aldrich followed the notebook's final clue toward the ancient stones Rowan had mentioned. Before reaching Blackwater Crossing, villagers had told him there stood ruins older than the kingdom itself. Naturally, nobody recommended visiting them, which, in bardic terms, was practically an invitation. Near sunset, he found them. Broken columns rose from the hillside. Half-buried walls crossed the grass. A ring of standing stones crowned the ridge, each carved with symbols soft by centuries of rain and wind. The place was silent. Not empty. Silent. There was a difference. Aldrich stepped carefully among the ruins, lute held close, as though music itself might make a suitable shield. It probably would not, but it made him feel better. The carvings on the stones fascinated him. Spirals, birds, open hands, lines that seemed almost like musical marks, though not in any notation he recognized. One stone bore the image of a human figure with both arms raised, surrounded by smaller figures in a circle. Singers, perhaps villagers complaining about taxes. History could be difficult to interpret. Aldrich opened Rowan's notebook and compared its sketches to the markings. Rowan had been here, and that much became clear. Several drawings matched the stones exactly. Beside one sketch, Rowan had written, "Not decoration." Instruction? Aldrich frowned. Instruction for what? He walked the ring slowly. The wind shifted. A faint tone passed between the stones, soft and low. At first, Aldrich thought it was imagination again. Then it happened once more. The sound came when wind moved through narrow gaps carved into the stone. Each gap shaped the air differently. Each produced a different note. Aldrich smiled despite himself. The runes were not only runes. They were an instrument, a very large, impractical instrument. Yes, nobody was likely to carry it to a wedding feast, unless they owned several oxen and had very patient friends. But still, an instrument. He spent the next hour listening. When the wind moved steadily, the stones murmured in scattered tones. Not quite a melody, not random either. Aldrich followed the sounds around the circle, humming softly beneath his breath. Certain notes matched fragments he had heard from Melan's humming and the strange sound in Elderwood. His pulse quickened. The stones held part of the forgotten melody, not written, not sung, carved into the shape of the ruins themselves. As dusk deepened, Aldrich discovered a narrow stairway descending beneath a collapsed arch. It led underground, because of course it did. Ancient ruins never seemed satisfied remaining above ground, where everyone could enjoy a nice, safe mystery in daylight. He lit a small lantern and descended. The air below smelled of damp earth, old stone, and roots. H.I.'s footsteps echoed in a passageway lined with carvings. Unlike the weathered stones above, these markings were clear. Figures stood in processions. Some carried instruments, others held scrolls. At the center of one wall, a group of singers surrounded a sleeping child. Above them, carved lines curved outward, like sound made visible. Aldrich traced the wall with his eyes. The images told a story, though not one he fully understood. A community had once gathered here to sing, not for entertainment alone, for remembrance, for teaching, for protection. Deep in the passage, he found a small chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal. Upon it lay nitrogen monoxide treasure, nitrogen monoxide crown, nitrogen monoxide jeweled relic. Just a shallow bowl filled with rainwater dripping from the ceiling. Aldrich sighed. Ancient civilizations clearly had a different understanding of dramatic reward. Still, beside the bowl, carved into the pedestal, were words in an older form of the kingdom's tongue. He translated slowly. Voice carries what stone cannot. Memory carries what voice forgets. Song carries what memory fears. Aldrich stood very still. That was nitrogen monoxide. Tavern riddle, tossed around for amusement. That was a warning, or a lesson, possibly both. The walls around the chamber contained more symbols. He sketched them into his own notebook. Careful to copy every mark, one sequence appeared repeatedly. A curve, 3 dots, a falling line, a spiral, when he quietly plucked notes on his lute that matched the wind tones above. The chamber responded. Not loudly, not magically in the obvious sense. No glowing lights. Nitrogen monoxide thunder. Nitrogen monoxide dramatic ghost, appearing to criticize his posture. Only resonance, the stones answered. Certain notes caused faint vibrations beneath his feet. Others did nothing. Piece by piece, Aldrich tested the sequence. The melody that emerged was brief. 5 notes only. Gentle, mournful, unfinished. Yet when he played it correctly, the water in the bowl trembled. Tiny circles spread across its surface. Then reflected lantern light seemed to reveal faint marks. Beneath the water, Aldrich leaned closer. At the bottom of the bowl, hidden under the ripples, was another carving, a bird with a broken wing. Beneath it, a single word, oath. He copied that too. The curiosity of the place stayed with him. Some ancient builders had carved chambers to sing back at very specific tones, turning architecture into memory. A person could forget a lyric, lose a scroll, or argue about history until everyone's soup went cold. But stone shaped for sound could keep a secret for centuries. When Aldrich finally climbed back into open air, night had fallen. Stars glittered above the ring of stones. The wind moved gently through the carvings, producing faint notes that drifted across the ridge. The sound nitrogen monoxide longer felt random. It felt like someone whispering from far away. Aldrich sat among the ruins and played the 5-note phrase again. The melody hung in the darkness, brief, fragile, waiting for something to complete it. He thought of Rowan. The vanished storyteller had come here and decided the answer lay elsewhere, beyond Blackwater Crossing. But now Aldrich understood something Rowan must have learned. The forgotten melody was not hidden in one place. It had been scattered deliberately, across Villages, stories, runes, memories, and perhaps oaths. That word troubled him most. Oath. A promise broken? A vow preserved? A warning tied to the song? Aldrich did not yet know. But as he settled beneath his cloak among the ancient stones, he felt the journey shifting again. This was nitrogen monoxide, longer merely a bard chasing a rare tune. IT was a trail left by people who had feared forgetting something important, something they had hidden so carefully that centuries later, only fragments remained. Above him, the stars watched in silence. Around him, the stones murmured when the wind passed through them. And somewhere ahead, beyond Blackwater Crossing, an old promise waited to be remembered. At dawn, Aldrich left the ancient stones behind and descended toward Blackwater Crossing. The road narrowed. SIT approached the river. Mist clung to the banks, thick enough to make trees appear like pale ghosts waiting politely for breakfast. The water itself moved slowly beneath, a wooden bridge darkened by age, its surface reflecting the gray morning sky. Blackwater Crossing was not a village, not quite. IT was a cluster of cottages, a mill, a toll house, and one very serious goat standing in the middle of the road, as if appointed by the crown. Aldrich waited. The goat did not move. "Good morning." Aldrich sighed. The goat blinked. After a tense negotiation involving half an apple, the bard continued. Beyond the bridge, the land rose toward a manor on a hill. Its stone walls were old but well kept. Banners hung motionless in the damp air. This was Ashcombe Hall, home of Lord Edric Vale, whose family had ruled the surrounding lands for generations. According to Rowan's notebook, an oath had once been sworn there. Aldrich was not especially fond of nobles, not because he disliked them personally. Some were pleasant enough, but noble households had a way of turning even simple questions into ceremonies involving waiting rooms, suspicious guards, and meals where nobody explained which spoon meant peace. Still, he climbed the hill. At the gate, 2 guards stopped him. "Business? I am a bard. That is not business." IT becomes business when people are bored. The guard considered this. A fair point had entered the battlefield. Eventually, Aldrich was admitted, mostly because Lady Marin, Lord Edric's widowed mother, enjoyed music and had apparently not been entertained by anyone interesting for weeks. Inside the hall, Aldrich played during the midday meal. He chose gentle songs first, then livelier ones. By the final tune, even Lord Edric's stern steward tapped one finger against the table, though he looked deeply offended by his own enjoyment. Afterward, Lady Marin invited Aldrich to sit near the hearth. She was elderly, sharp-eyed, and dressed in dark green wool. Her voice moved softly, but everyone nearby listened when she spoke. So she sighed. "You did not come here only to sing." Aldrich smiled. "Was IT that obvious? You watch the walls more than the guests. I admire stonework. Nitrogen monoxide bard admires stonework that intensely." Caught. Aldrich mentioned the runes, the word carved beneath the water, and Rowan's old notes. At Rowan's name, Lady Marin's expression changed. There IT was again, that small flicker, recognition wrapped in sadness. "You knew him," Aldrich sighed. "I did. Did he come here?" "Many years ago." She looked into the fire. He asked about a promise. The hall around them seemed to grow quieter. Lady Marin explained that generations earlier, Before Ashcombe Hall bore its current name, there had been a feud between the Vale family and the people of Elderwood. Not a grand war with armies and banners, but the smaller, meaner kind of conflict that grows from pride, bad harvests, unpaid debts, and men with too much armor and not enough imagination. The dispute ended after a winter of hunger. A Vale lord, desperate to restore peace, swore an oath before witnesses from the forest villages. His house would protect the old songs of Elderwood. In return, the people would share knowledge of paths, herbs, springs, and safe crossings. IT had been practical, not romantic. Peace often began that way, a bargain made because everyone was tired and cold. Aldrich leaned forward. The old songs included the forgotten melody. Lady Marin nodded slowly. So Rowan believed? What happened to the oath? Her mouth tightened. IT was forgotten. Aldrich almost laughed, though not from humor. Of course it was. The forgotten melody, protected by a forgotten oath, hidden in forgotten runes. History really did enjoy committing to a theme. Lady Marin continued. Over generations, the Vale family grew richer. They built toll roads, bought lands, married into stronger houses. The old forest agreements became embarrassing relics. Eventually, one ambitious lord ordered records of the oath removed from the hall archives. Not destroyed. Exactly. Nobles rarely destroyed things, when hiding them in a locked room sounded more dignified. But they were buried, ignored, left to dust. The people of Elderwood remembered betrayal. The Vales remembered inconvenience. Aldrich sat silently. The melody was becoming less like a magical legend and more like a wound covered poorly by time. Lady Marin rose and ellied him through a side passage to a small private chamber. There, behind a carved panel, she revealed a narrow shelf of old documents. I kept these after my husband died, she sighed. WHY? Because men who inherit power often misplace humility. Aldrich nodded. That sounded accurate enough to embroider on a cushion among the documents. Lay a cracked, leather-bound account. It's PAGES described. The oath in formal language. Witnesses, terms, names. At the bottom was a symbol Aldrich recognized. A bird with a broken wing. The same mark from the stone bowl. Beside IT, written in faded ink, was a line of verse. When wing is mended, memory returns. Aldrich copied the line carefully. Lady Marin watched him. Rowan copied that too. Did he say where he was going next? He believed another piece of the song survived among traveling performers. Aldrich remembered the fair Malin had mentioned. Where? South of Silver Road, the Harvest Fair of Weichmere. Aldrich knew of it. Everyone knew of IT. The fair drew merchants, jugglers, fortune tellers, puppeteers, singers, spice sellers, horse traders, and at least 3 men every year claiming to sell genuine dragon teeth. Those teeth were usually goat teeth, occasionally dog teeth. Once, famously, carved turnips. Medieval commerce had range. Before Aldrich left the chamber, Lady Marin shared an eccentric curiosity from her family's records. One Vale ancestor had kept a silenced tax, charging villagers a coin if their pigs squealed too loudly near the manor road. The tax lasted 1 month, ending when villagers trained every pig in the valley to squeal outside his window at sunrise. History, Aldrich thought, was sometimes justice wearing muddy boots. That evening, Lord Edric requested one final song. Aldrich chose the 5-note phrase from the ruins and, gently wove the oath verse around IT. The hall quieted. Lady Marin closed her eyes. For a moment, something old seemed to pass through the room. Not magic exactly. Memory. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that sits down uninvited and clears its throat. When the final note faded, nobody spoke. Then Lady Marin whispered, "Perhaps it is time we remembered." Aldrich left Ashcombe Hall the next morning with copied records, another fragment of melody, and a deeper understanding of the road ahead. The forgotten melody had not vanished by accident. IT had been neglected, hidden and softened by pride until only scraps remained. But scraps could be gathered, songs could be mended, and somewhere at the harvest fair of Wychmere, amid laughter, lanterns, cheap tricks, and suspicious dragon teeth, another broken piece was waiting. The road to Wychmere wound through rolling countryside bright with the colors of early harvest. Golden fields stretched across the hills. Farmers worked beneath clear skies. Wagons rattled along dusty lanes carrying grain, apples, and enough turnips to convince any traveler that turnips secretly ruled the kingdom. For 3 days, Aldrich followed the southern roads. The journey felt lighter than previous stretches. Not easier, just clearer. The clues were beginning to connect. The runes, the oath, the bird symbol, the scattered fragments of melody. Each discovery added another thread to a tapestry still hidden from view. He spent the evenings studying Rowan's notebook beside campfires. Again and again, his attention returned to one phrase. The melody hides inside memory. At first, the words seemed poetic. Bards appreciated poetic statements, but the deeper Aldrich traveled, the more literal they appeared. The song survived because people remembered pieces, not because anyone possessed the whole. A farmer remembered a verse. A shepherd remembered a tune. A noble family remembered an oath. The melody existed across countless minds rather than in a single place. IT was an unusual way to preserve something, perhaps the only way. On the fourth morning, distant sounds drifted across the countryside. Music, laughter, bells. The harvest fair of Wychmere had begun. By noon, Aldrich crested a hill and saw it spread across the valley below. Colorful tents filled open fields. Banners fluttered in the breeze. Crowds moved between stalls like streams flowing through a landscape of cloth and wood. The scent of roasting meats, baked pastries, and spiced cider drifted upward. Even from a distance, the fair felt alive, the kind of place where stories multiplied naturally, and stories, Aldrich suspected, were exactly what he needed. As he entered the fairgrounds, his senses nearly surrendered. Everywhere he looked, something demanded attention. Jugglers tossed flaming torches. Musicians performed beside market stalls. Acrobats balanced on ropes. Merchants shouted enthusiastic claims about products that almost certainly could not accomplish what was advertised. One man attempted to sell a chicken he described as extremely philosophical. The chicken seemed unconvinced. Aldrich wandered through the crowds for hours. He performed music in exchange for meals, shared stories with travelers, collected rumors most proved useless. One woman insisted the forgotten melody was hidden inside a giant mushroom. Another claimed IT had been swallowed by a whale. A third suggested IT might be buried beneath a monastery. That was slightly more reasonable. Only slightly. Near sunset, Aldrich found himself drawn toward a circle of listeners. Gathered around a small stage, an elderly performer stood there telling stories. Not singing, storytelling. His voice carried easily across the crowd. The audience laughed, gasped, leaned closer, and suddenly Aldrich understood why Rowan had loved the craft. A great storyteller could shape an entire crowd's emotions with nothing more than words. When the performance ended, Aldrich approached. The storyteller introduced himself as Oswin, a thin man with bright eyes and a beard that seemed determined to escape in multiple directions at once. They shared supper beneath a striped tent while discussing music and legends. Eventually, Aldrich mentioned the forgotten melody. Oswin immediately stopped chewing. That reaction was becoming wonderfully predictable. "You've heard of IT?" The storyteller nodded slowly. "I've heard fragments." "Where?" "Everywhere." Aldrich sighed. "Another mysterious answer." Oswin laughed. "You sound disappointed." "I've traveled a very long distance collecting answers that create additional questions." "Then you're learning how history works." "FAIR enough." As darkness settled across the fairgrounds, lanterns illuminated the pathways. Music drifted through the night. The storyteller finally shared what he knew. Long ago, he explained, performers traveled between villages, carrying more than entertainment. They carried news, lessons, local histories, memories. In many regions, wandering singers served as living archives. Important knowledge survived because people repeated IT. The forgotten melody, according to some traditions, had once belonged to those memory keepers. Not one song, a framework, a way of storing information inside music. Aldrich immediately remembered the ruins, the singers carved into stone, the phrase beneath the bowl. Everything pointed in the same direction. What happened to them? Oswin shrugged. Kingdoms changed. People forgot. People always forget. The storyteller stared toward the lantern-lit crowd. That's why songs matter. For a moment, neither spoke. The fair continued around them. Laughter, music, distant applause. Life moving in every direction at once. Then Oswin leaned closer. "There's someone you should meet." Aldrich's pulse quickened. "Who?" "A performer called Lyra." The name meant nothing to him, yet Oswin's expression suggested otherwise. "WHY?" "Because she knows a tune nobody can explain." That sounded promising, possibly dangerous, usually both. Oswin directed him toward a cluster of performers camped near the eastern edge of the fair. Aldrich found the camp shortly afterward. Musicians sat around fires. Jugglers practiced tricks. A puppeteer argued passionately with a carpenter about the structural integrity of wooden dragons. Neither seemed willing to compromise. Near the largest fire sat a young woman tuning a harp. Her dark cloak blended with the evening. Shadows, silver threads decorated the instrument. She looked up as Aldrich approached. "Lyra?" "Depends who's asking." "A bard." She winced dramatically. "Another one," Aldrich laughed. "A painful profession? There are far too many of you." A fair observation. After introductions, they spent an hour discussing music. Lyra possessed remarkable skill. More importantly, she possessed remarkable memory. She could hear a melody once and reproduce IT perfectly, an ability Aldrich secretly envied. Eventually, he mentioned the forgotten melody. Unlike most people, she did not look surprised. Instead, she nodded. "I know part of IT." Aldrich nearly dropped HIS cup. "You do?" "Possibly. Possibly." Lyra set down her harp. "My grandmother taught me a tune." Without further explanation, She began to play. The first notes instantly captured his attention. Gentle, ancient, unfamiliar, yet connected. Aldrich recognized elements from the ruins, echoes of Melon's humming, patterns hidden inside the five-note fragment. The melody flowed like water through memory, beautiful, incomplete, but undeniably connected. When she finished, silence lingered. Aldrich stared. That's part of IT, I suspected. You never investigated? Lyra smiled. My grandmother warned me. About what? She said people who chase the melody stop living ordinary lives. Aldrich considered this. His recent experiences suggested she might have a point. The harpist reached into a travel chest beside her. Inside rested a small wooden box. Carefully she opened IT. Within lay several yellowed pages, handwritten music, notes, lyrics generations old. My family preserved these. Aldrich examined them carefully. Among the markings appeared the familiar bird symbol, and beneath IT, another line. When voices join, the wing grows stronger. The pattern continued. Wing, memory, voices, oath. Fragments scattered across centuries, like pieces of a puzzle, hidden deliberately. The discovery left Aldrich awake long after midnight. He sat outside his tent, studying copied notes beneath lantern light. Around him, the fair gradually settled into sleep. Music faded. Voices quieted. The stars emerged overhead. Somewhere nearby, a horse snored. Impressively, the animal seemed deeply committed to the craft. Aldrich smiled. Then his attention returned to the growing collection of clues. For the first time, he could almost sense the shape of the larger melody. Not hear IT, not understand IT, but feel its outline, like seeing a distant mountain through fog. The summit remained hidden, yet the mountain itself was unmistakable. And now another guide had entered the story, another keeper of memory, another person connected to the fragments. As the lantern burned low beside him, Aldrich wondered whether chance had truly led him here, or whether the melody had been guiding seekers toward one another all along. The thought followed him into sleep, and somewhere beyond the fairgrounds, beyond the roads and hills, Silvermere Lake waited beneath the moonlight. By morning, the harvest fair of Wychmere had already begun waking in pieces. Smoke lifted from cooking fires. Merchants opened tent flaps. Jugglers stretched their arms as though preparing for battle against gravity itself. Aldrich found Lyra near the eastern camp, packing her harp with practiced care. You're leaving, he sighed. So are you. I hadn't said that. You have the face. What face? The face of a man about to walk directly into avoidable trouble. Aldrich sighed. Apparently everyone knew that face except him. Lyra had spent part of the night thinking about the melody her grandmother preserved. By dawn, she had remembered a detail almost too small to matter, which naturally meant it mattered very much. Her grandmother had once spoken of Silvermere Lake, not as a place where the melody began, as a place where voices returned. That phrase followed Aldrich for the entire morning. Voices returned. IT sounded poetic. IT also sounded like exactly the sort of phrase that eventually allied a man into cold water. Still, he and Lyra traveled north together after leaving the fair behind. The road rolled through orchards, then open fields, then a region of pale grasses where the wind moved in long, sighing waves. They did not hurry. The day was clear. The air smelled of apples, dry leaves, and distant rain. Lyra proved excellent company, though she possessed a talent for saying very unsettling things in a calm voice. Some songs are older than the people singing them, she said at one point. Aldrich glanced over. That is either wisdom or a warning. Usually both. Wonderful. By late afternoon, they reached the road descending toward Silvermere. The lake appeared suddenly between dark hills, wide and still beneath a lavender sky. Its surface reflected clouds so perfectly that it seemed the world had folded in half. A small lakeside hamlet rested along the shore. Fishing boats rocked gently beside wooden docks. Reeds whispered at the water's edge. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Perhaps, though, Aldrich admitted that after recent events he had become suspicious of peaceful scenery. A man could not investigate forgotten songs for long without expecting every pond, tree, and unusually shaped turnip to contain historical significance. They found lodging with a fisherman named Tavern, a cheerful widower with broad hands and a laugh loud enough to frighten ducks into reconsidering their life choices. Over supper, Aldrich asked about Silvermere's legends. Tauren grinned. The lake voices. Lyra looked up. Aldrich leaned forward. Tauren explained that on certain moonlit nights, people crossing Silvermere heard singing over the water. Nitrogen monoxide source. Nitrogen monoxide visible singer. Just voices drifting across the surface. Some said they belonged to drowned travelers. Others said they were echoes trapped in mist. One very determined local claimed the lake itself was lonely and enjoyed choir practice. Aldrich almost preferred that version. Have you heard them? Lyra asked. Tauren nodded. ONCE. What did they sing? The fisherman's smile faded slightly. Nothing I understood. That night the moon rose full and pale. Tauren agreed to row them across the lake, though he insisted this was a foolish idea. He said this while preparing the boat, then repeated it while loading lanterns, then mentioned IT again while pushing away from shore. Aldrich appreciated consistency. The boat slipped across Silvermere's smooth surface. Oars dipped softly. Moonlight spilled across the water in a silver path. Mist gathered low and thin around them. The world seemed to shrink until only the boat, the lake, and the moon existed. For a long while nobody spoke. Even Tauren rowed quietly. Aldrich held his lute in his lap. Lyra sat opposite him, one hand resting on her covered harp. The silence deepened. Then came the sound. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from wind. A voice, then another, then many, singing across the water. Aldrich's breath caught. The voices were soft, layered, distant, and strangely warm. Not mournful, not frightening, more like a memory heard from another room. Lyra slowly uncovered her harp. The melody drifted around them, unclear, fragmented, yet Aldrich recognized pieces. The 5-note phrase from the Stones, the shape of Lyra's inherited tune, the rise and fall of Melon's humming. He carefully lifted his lute and played the fragment he knew. Lyra joined. With her harp, the lake voices shifted. Not louder, closer. Tauren stopped rowing. The boat drifted. Music moved. Over the water, for one extraordinary moment, the fragments seemed to answer one another. Aldrich heard new notes hidden between the old ones. A bridge, a turn, a softer ending. He played carefully, afraid that pressing too hard would break the moment. Lyra followed, her expression still and focused. The lake carried their music outward. Then the unseen voices returned and changed, completed by another phrase. Aldrich nearly laughed from wonder. Silvermere did not merely echo sound. IT reshaped IT, or rather, the lake's cliffs and hollows caught certain tones and returned harmonies ancient singers must have understood. That was the eccentric truth of the place. Some lakes, when bordered by curved stone and still air, could carry voices farther than seemed reasonable, turning one singer into many. IT was less ghostly than villagers claimed, but honestly, not by much. A natural echo at midnight still had excellent theatrical instincts. When the music faded, Lyra whispered, "Did you hear IT?" Aldrich nodded. "I heard another piece. So did I." Torrin looked between them. "I heard enough to know I dislike scholarly boats." Aldrich smiled. A fair position. They crossed to a small island at the lake's center, where reeds grew around a ruined stone landing. Torrin tied the boat while Aldrich and Lyra explored by lantern light. At the island's highest point stood a weathered marker. Its carvings were nearly gone, but the bird symbol remained. This time the broken wing was half mended. Beneath IT, Aldrich found a line carved shallowly into the stone. "What is shared cannot be buried." He copied the words. Lyra hummed. The lake's returned phrase, softly, preserving it before sleep or distraction could steal it away. Aldrich listened, then repeated it on the lute. Together they fixed the new fragment in memory. By the time they returned to shore, the moon had begun sinking westward. The hamlet slept. Mist curled along the water. Torrin accepted payment with the expression of a man who would be telling this story for years, while making himself sound significantly braver each time. Aldrich did not blame him. As dawn paled beyond the hills, the bard sat beside the lake, writing by weak light. The melody was growing, still incomplete, still mysterious, but nitrogen monoxide, longer distant. IT had crossed from rumor into sound, from sound into memory, and now as Silvermere shimmered beneath the first gentle glow of morning, Aldrich understood one thing more clearly than before. The song was not meant to belong to one person. Every clue said the same. Voices joined. Memory returned. What was shared endured. Somewhere beyond the lake the next keeper waited, and the road, patient as ever, stretched onward. The morning after Silvermere felt washed clean. Pale sunlight rested on the lake, turning the water from silver to blue-gray, and the reeds whispered softly along the shore. Aldrich and Lyra left the fisherman's cottage after breakfast, carrying fresh bread, dried fish, and Torrin's repeated warning that hills were worse than lakes because at least lakes had the honesty to drown you flat. Aldrich thanked him for the encouragement. Torrin looked proud. The road climbed away from Silvermere almost immediately. Before long, the lake disappeared behind them, hidden by slopes thick with pine and thornbush. The air grew cooler as they moved into rougher country. Thorn Ridge waited ahead. IT was not a town, not a village, not even a proper region, depending on who was complaining. IT was a jagged stretch of hills where narrow paths twisted between rocks and wind-bent trees. Travelers avoided IT when possible, which naturally meant hermits loved IT. Hermits had a marvelous gift for finding places where even goats looked around and thought. Perhaps not. By midday, Aldrich already regretted several choices. His boots slipped on loose stones. His cloak caught on brambles. At one point, Lyra watched him untangle himself from a thorn bush with the calm patience of someone enjoying free entertainment. "Need help?" as H.E. asked. "No." You seem embraced by nature. Nature is being overly familiar. Eventually they found a narrow trail marked by strips of faded cloth tied to branches. Lyra recognized them as old path signs. Aldrich recognized them as deeply suspicious. Still, they followed. Late afternoon brought them to a hut tucked beneath a leaning pine near the ridge's crest. Smoke curled from a hole in the roof. Bundles of herbs hung from the eaves. Clay charms clicked softly in the wind. An elderly man sat outside sharpening a small knife. He had a long, white beard, sharp eyes, and the general appearance of someone who had been arguing with society for decades and winning. "You're late," he sighed. Aldrich paused. "We had an appointment? Nitrogen monoxide. Then late for what?" The old man shrugged. "Everything." That seemed hard to dispute. The hermit was called Edrin. He spoke as though each word cost him a coin, yet somehow still managed to sound amused by everything. When Aldrich mentioned Rowan, Edrin snorted. "Talked too much." "You knew him?" Everyone knew Rowan. He asked questions until rocks considered moving. Lyra smiled. "That sounds useful." "Useful is not the same as restful." Edrin invited them inside. The hut was crowded with shelves, bundles, stones, feathers, clay tablets, and objects whose purpose Aldrich refused to guess. A kettle simmered over a small fire. The air smelled of mint, smoke, and something bitter enough to discipline the tongue. They sat on low stools, while Edrin poured tea. Aldrich took one sip. His face attempted diplomacy and failed. "Good." Edrin sighed. "For what?" "Regret." Lyra hid a smile. Aldrich carefully set the cup down. Edrin listened while they described the ruins, the oath, the fair, and Silvermere. He sighed nothing during the telling, though his expression sharpened at each new fragment. When Aldrich played the pieces they had gathered, the hermit closed his eyes. The hut grew quiet. Outside, wind moved through the hanging charms. When the last note faded, Adrian opened his eyes again. "That song is not lost?" Aldrich leaned forward. "Then what is IT?" "Divided." YES. "We gathered that." "Nitrogen monoxide." The hermit tapped the table. "Not broken. Divided." Aldrich waited. There was nitrogen monoxide rushing people like Edrin. Trying would only make them slower out of principle. The hermit explained that ancient memory singers never trusted single records. A scroll could burn. A king could lie. A priest could miscopy. A line because his lunch was late. So important. Knowledge was divided among communities. One group kept rhythm. Another kept words. Another kept melody. Another kept meaning. Only when brought together could the full memory return. Aldrich felt the pieces settle in his mind. The forgotten melody had been designed to require many people, not as weakness, as protection. Edrin rose and took a clay disc from a shelf. Upon it was carved the bird symbol, now with both wings drawn, but separated by a line. "My teacher gave me this," he sighed. "Who was your teacher?" "A woman older than Winter and twice as rude." "Sounds memorable." "She was." He placed the disc between them. Around the bird were marks, resembling beats or steps, not notes. Rhythm. Lyra touched the edge gently. "This is part of the song." "The bones of IT," Edrin sighed. He tapped the table in a slow pattern. Aldrich listened. The rhythm changed everything. When layered, beneath the fragments, the melody nitrogen monoxide longer wandered. IT moved with purpose, like feet along an old road. Lyra joined softly with her harp. Aldrich followed with Lute. Edrin tapped. The hut filled with music. Not loud, not polished, but steady. For the first time, the pieces felt less like scattered memories and more like the beginning of something whole. Then Edrin stopped. Enough? Aldrich blinked. Why? Why? Had I wish and why? Then Edrin stopped. Enough? Then Edrin stopped. And Edric blinked. Why? Ein, Nielsen, and Grind? Because you do not yet know what you are carrying. The old man said again, gaze fixed on the fire. He told them one more eccentric truth. In certain mountain villages, messages were once sent by drum patterns across valleys. A warning could travel faster than a horse, provided nobody mistook raiders coming for bring cheese, which apparently happened once and became legendary for all the wrong reasons. The forgotten melody, Edrin said, had worked in a similar spirit. IT carried memory in layers. Anyone could enjoy the tune, but only joined keepers could understand its full message. What message? Aldrich asked. Edrin looked toward the wall. Ask the archives, Aldrich sighed. Of course. Leary folded her arms. The Royal Archives? Where else do powerful people hide things they claim not to have? That matched Lady Marin's story too neatly to ignore. Edrin explained that Rowan had come to Thornridge years earlier. He had learned the rhythm just as Aldrich had. Then he left for the royal city. Did he find what he sought? The hermit's expression darkened. He found enough to become afraid. Aldrich felt a chill. Afraid of what? Of men who prefer silence. Outside, the wind struck the hut, rattling the charms. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Edrin pushed the clay disc toward Aldrich. Take the pattern. Leave the disc. Aldrich copied IT carefully into his notebook. Lyra repeated the rhythm until she knew IT by heart. Night settled around Thornridge. The hut creaked softly in the wind. Edrin gave them blankets and refused all thanks with impressive efficiency. Aldrich slept poorly, dreaming of wings, drums, locked doors, and a song too large for one voice. At dawn, the hermit walked them to the trail. Remember, he sighed, a memory kept alone becomes a prison. Aldrich nodded. And shared? Edrin's eyes softened. A bridge. Then he turned back toward his hut without farewell. Hermits, Aldrich decided, treated farewells as unnecessary decorations. He and Lyra descended Thornridge with the rhythm fixed in their minds. The royal city waited far beyond the hills. So did the archives. So, perhaps, did the truth Rowan had feared. And as the road unfolded beneath a pale morning sky, Aldrich could feel the melody moving with them now, steady as footsteps, patient as memory, and nitrogen monoxide longer willing to remain buried. The road to the royal city took 5 days. Aldrich and Lyra crossed stony passes, sleepy hamlets, and long stretches of farmland where crows watched them from fence posts with the judgmental air of tiny black magistrates. By the 5th afternoon, the city appeared beyond a bend in the road. High walls rose from the plain. Towers caught the pale sunlight. Beyond the gates, rooftops crowded together in a smoky maze of lanes, markets, chapels, courtyards, and noble houses built by people who clearly believed height was the same thing as importance. Aldrich slowed. Lyra glanced at him. Nervous? Of course not. You are gripping your lute like IT owes you money. He relaxed his hand. I dislike archives. You dislike reading? I dislike buildings where silence is enforced by elderly clerks. The Royal Archives stood beside the old palace chapel, a long stone building with narrow windows and iron-bound doors. Inside, the air smelled of parchment, dust, wax, and authority. A clerk at the front desk looked up as they entered. He had thin spectacles, a narrow face, and the expression of a man who had personally invented disappointment. "Purpose?" he asked. "Research," Aldrich sighed. The clerk waited. Aldrich waited back. Lyra stepped in. "We seek records concerning old agreements between House Vale and Elderwood, along with any references to ceremonial songs, memory singers, or the broken wing mark." The clerk blinked. Aldrich whispered, "That was much better. I noticed." Access took time. There were forms, then more forms, then a smaller form confirming they had received. The first forms, government, Aldrich reflected, was simply a dragon made of ink. Eventually, with Lady Mern's copied seal and Lyra's calm persistence, they were admitted into a reading chamber. Shelves rose high around them. Scrolls lay stacked in wooden cases. Ledgers lined the walls. A clerk brought them old indexes and warned them not to breathe aggressively near fragile documents. Aldrich promised moderate breathing. For hours, they searched. Most records were useless. Tax lists, marriage contracts, border disputes, a truly heroic number of arguments about mill rights. Then Lyra found the first sign, a faded reference. In a court inventory, songs of accord removed from public record by order of Chancellor Haven. Aldrich leaned over. "Removed where?" Lyra followed the line with her finger. "Restricted cabinet." Naturally, the restricted cabinet stood behind a locked grate at the far end of the chamber. The clerk refused them access, then refused again, then refused in slightly different words. Aldrich considered playing music to soften him. Lyra advised against attacking bureaucracy with charm before supper. Instead, SHE asked about appeal procedure. The clerk sighed with visible suffering. An hour later, they stood before the deputy keeper of records, Mistress Cale, a woman with silver hair and eyes sharp enough to trim candles. She listened without interrupting, then asked, "Why does this matter?" Aldrich could have lied. Instead, he played the melody fragments softly. Lyra added the rhythm on the table with 2 fingers. The chamber changed, not dramatically, but enough. Mistress Cale's expression shifted from skepticism to recognition. "I heard that when I was a child," she said. "Where?" Aldrich asked. "My grandmother sang one line during storms." She looked toward the locked cabinet. "Wait here." She returned with a small bundle of documents tied in red cord. Inside were notes, decrees, and copied testimonies. They told a troubling story. Generations after the oath between House Vale and Elderwood, royal officials feared the forest communities held too much independence. Their songs preserved border agreements, rights of passage, water claims, and protections older than many noble titles. Written records could be edited, but songs remembered publicly were harder to erase, so officials labeled the memory singers unreliable, then disruptive, then dangerous. The old songs were discouraged, mocked, and finally banned from formal gatherings. Aldrich sat back slowly. The forgotten melody was not hidden because IT was cursed. IT was hidden because IT protected memory from power. Lyra's face had gone pale with anger. They erased people's rights. "They tried," Mistress Cale sobbed. Her voice was quiet. Not entirely. She unfolded another page. A report mentioned a final gathering called the Concord of Voices. Representatives from villages, performers, hermits, and noble witnesses divided the melody into parts, so nitrogen monoxide's single authority could destroy IT, rhythm to the hills, echo to the lake, verse to the performers, oath to the halls, stone to the ruins, and the final meaning sealed in the royal archive. Aldrich looked at the page. What meaning? Mistress Kale handed him a thin parchment. At the bottom was the bird symbol. This time, both wings were whole. Beneath it lay a verse, not musical notation. Words, when memory gathers, no crown owns the road. When voices answer, no lord owns the spring. When promise is spoken, nitrogen monoxide hand breaks the wing. Aldrich read it twice, then a third time. The truth settled around him like evening. The melody was a living charter, a song of shared rights and mutual protection, designed so common people could remember what rulers preferred to bury. That was the eccentric wonder of IT. Entire communities had once carried law inside melody, not merely entertainment, not decoration, but practical memory dressed as song. A tune could hold a boundary line better than a bored clerk, and frankly, with more grace. Rowan found this, Aldrich sighed. Mistress Kale nodded. He did. Aldrich looked up sharply. You knew him? He came here 20 years ago. What happened? The keeper hesitated. He copied the verse, then he discovered others were searching for IT too. Who? Men loyal to families who benefited from the forgetting. Laurie's hand tightened around her harp strap. Mistress, Kale continued. Rowan believed the melody should be restored publicly. Others wanted IT destroyed before villages remembered old promises. Aldrich's thoughts turned to Brindle Hollow, to its vanished laughter, to Rowan's abandoned cottage. Did they take him? I do not know, she sighed. He left the city in haste. He sighed he would return to Elderwood by hidden roads, and never arrived. Silence answered. Mistress Kale allowed them to copy the verse, though she warned them carefully. Once this song is whole, IT will not merely entertain. Aldrich gave a faint smile. I am beginning to notice. As evening bells rang beyond the archive walls, he and Lyra stepped back into the city streets. Crowds moved around them, vendors called, hooves struck cobblestone. Smoke rose from chimneys. The world continued as though nothing had changed. Yet Aldrich felt the weight of the copied verse beneath his cloak. They had found the heart of the forgotten melody, not the ending, not yet, but its meaning. And somewhere between the city and Elderwood, rival seekers might already be following the same trail, eager to silence the song before IT could be shared again. They left the royal city before sunrise. Mist lay low over the streets, softening the sharp edges of rooftops and towers while early bakers opened shutters and stable. Boys swept courtyards with the enthusiasm of people awake against their will. Aldrich and Lyra moved quickly through the eastern gate. Neither spoke much at first. The copied archive verse rested beneath Aldrich's cloak, wrapped beside Rowan's notebook and the gathered fragments. IT felt less like carrying paper now and more like carrying a sleeping bell, quiet, heavy, waiting to be rung. The road toward Elderwood stretched across open country. Behind them, the royal city shrank into gray distance. Ahead, the land rose gradually into wooded hills. Aldrich had spent years wandering near Elderwood. Yet returning now felt different. He was not drifting anymore. The road had purpose beneath IT. Lyra noticed his silence. "You're thinking again. A terrible habit. Any useful thoughts?" "Possibly one. That's progress." Aldrich looked toward the horizon. The melody began around Elderwood, or at least part of it did. And maybe the forest remembers what people forgot. Lyra did not laugh. After everything they had seen, the idea nitrogen monoxide longer sounded absurd. By midday, they entered the outer woods. The trees stood tall and close, their branches weaving a green-gold roof above the path. Sunlight filtered down in soft patches. Moss covered fallen logs. Ferns crowded the roadside. At first, the forest seemed ordinary. Then Aldrich hummed the five-note phrase from the ruins. A breeze moved through the leaves. Not strong, not dramatic, but perfectly timed. Lyra stopped walking. "Do that again." He hummed once more. The leaves stirred. Somewhere ahead, a thrush answered with a short call that matched the rhythm Edrin had taught them. Aldrich slowly smiled. "Well, that is either meaningful, or birds are becoming smug. Both can be true." They followed the path deeper. The forest responded in small ways. A branch creaked after certain notes. A stream seemed to catch the rhythm. Bird calls echoed fragments back at unexpected moments. Nothing obvious enough for a sensible person to trust. Everything clear enough for a bard to follow. By late afternoon, they reached a glade Aldrich knew from childhood travels. At its center stood an ancient elder tree, broader than any nearby trunk, its bark twisted into folds like the face of someone who had listened patiently for centuries and developed opinions. Beneath its branches, small offerings lay tucked among roots, pebbles, ribbons, carved wooden birds. Lyra knelt beside one, the broken wing. Aldrich crouched. Several carvings showed birds with one wing damaged. Others showed both wings whole. The symbol had lived here all along, not in noble records, not hidden under lock in offerings. Left by ordinary hands. Aldrich felt something soften in his chest. The melody had never been entirely forgotten in Elderwood. It had simply been waiting under different names. An old woman emerged from the trees carrying a basket of mushrooms. She looked at Aldrich and Lyra without surprise. "You took long enough." Aldrich closed his eyes briefly. "Why does everyone say things like that?" The woman smiled. "Because young people arrive late to old stories." Her name was Sella. She was a gatherer from a nearby woodland settlement and apparently keeper of local customs nobody outside Elderwood bothered to ask about. When Aldrich showed her the bird symbol, she nodded. "That is the mended promise. You know IT? Every child here knows part of IT." Aldrich stared. "Part?" Sella turned toward the elder tree and sang a SOFT line. The words were simple, almost like a children's rhyme, but the shape of the melody fit perfectly against the fragments they had gathered. Lyra joined quietly with harp. Aldrich added, the rhythm beneath his breath. The glade seemed to hold the sound. Leaves trembled overhead, not because of magic, perhaps because sound moved through living wood and open air, because memory lived where people kept feeding IT, because sometimes the world does not need to glow to become astonishing. Sella explained the eccentric custom of Elderwood children learning tree calls, short sung phrases used to find one another in dense forest. Each family had variations, and some calls were older than anyone knew. To outsiders, it sounded like children playing. To Elderwood folk, IT was a map made of voices. Aldrich realized the final woodland fragment had survived his play. That almost made him laugh. Powerful men had locked records away. Officials had banned gatherings. Families had hidden verses, and children had kept singing the old rites between trees while chasing one another with muddy knees. History, once again, had chosen comedy as a hiding place. Sella allayed them to the nearby settlement before dusk. IT rested among tall trees, cottages built with low roofs and woven fences, smoke rising peacefully into the branches. People gathered. When they heard Aldrich and Lyra's purpose, some were cautious, others curious, a few elderly. Faces became deeply still at the mention of Rowan. He came through here, one man sighed. Years ago? Aldrich asked. 20. Was he alone? At first, the man's face darkened. He was followed. The warning settled over the group. Rowan had reached Elderwood. Almost. He had passed through the forest, carrying the archive verse, trying to restore what had been divided. But before he could gather the final voices, men came after him. Nobody knew who they served, only that Rowan vanished near the old western path, the same path leading toward the sleeping castle ruins. Aldrich remembered the outline of distant towers beyond Elderwood, abandoned since before his birth. Not yet. That road waited later. For now, the forest itself had given them another verse. That night, the settlement gathered beneath the elder trees. Aldrich, Lyra, Sella, and several villagers joined the fragments carefully. Stone phrase, lake echo, performer's verse, hermit's rhythm, archive meaning, forest call. The melody grew fuller, still incomplete, but alive. People listened with tears in their eyes, though nobody wept loudly. IT was quieter than that, deeper, like hearing. A door opened somewhere inside memory. When the song ended, the forest remained silent. Then children began humming the tree call again, softly, naturally, as though returning. Something to the air. Aldrich looked around the circle of faces lit by firelight. He understood now why the melody required many voices. One singer could be silenced. One book could be burned. One bard could disappear on a lonely road. But a song held by a people was harder to kill. Near midnight, as the fires burned low, Sella placed a carved wooden bird in Aldrich's hand. Its wings were whole. "Carry this," she said. "To where?" She looked west. To those who forgot they are not alone. Aldrich followed her gaze into the dark trees. The road ahead would not be gentle. Rival seekers were moving. Rowan's fate remained unknown, and the melody still lacked its final resting place. But beneath the familiar branches of Elderwood, with voices humming softly around him, Aldrich nitrogen monoxide longer felt like a wanderer chasing rumor. He felt like a messenger, and the forest, old and patient, seemed to remember his steps. By morning, word had traveled through Elderwood faster than any messenger could have managed. People came along narrow paths from scattered cottages and hidden clearings, carrying baskets, walking sticks, tools, and cautious hope. Some had heard only that a bard had returned with old fragments. Others had heard the bolder version, in which Aldrich had apparently wrestled a ghost on Silvermere, tricked a noble lord, and taught a royal clerk to dance. Aldrich denied 2 of those. The third depended on how generously one defined dancing. They gathered beneath the great elder tree, where Sella laid the carved wooden bird among the roots. Lyra tuned her harp nearby, listening as villagers offered memories that became the work of the day, not performance. Gathering, an old woodcutter remembered a line his mother sang during storms. A midwife knew a rhythm used while rocking sleepless infants. A beekeeper recalled a phrase hummed when moving hives, because bees apparently respected tradition more than many kings. Every fragment mattered. Some were false trails. Some belonged to entirely different songs. One elderly man confidently sang half, a drinking ballad about a duck that married a prince. Aldrich admitted it was memorable, though probably not legally significant. Still, piece by piece the melody strengthened. Aldrich copied everything. Lyra tested each phrase against the known fragments. Sella judged which belonged to Elderwood's older customs. Together, they worked like patient menders repairing a torn cloak one thread at a time. By afternoon, familiar faces began to appear. Torin arrived from Silvermere, loudly insisting he had come only because his cousin needed mushrooms, which convinced absolutely nitrogen monoxide won. Oswin the storyteller came with 2 performers from Wychmere. Even Bren the shepherd appeared, accompanied by 3 sheep and a deeply suspicious expression. "I brought witnesses," he sighed. Aldrich looked at the sheep. "They seem impartial. They are harsh but fair." The gathering grew. So did the risk. Near sunset, scouts from the western paths brought troubling news. Riders had been seen beyond the ridge. Armed men. Not soldiers bearing royal colors, but hired blades wearing dark cloaks and nitrogen monoxide house markings. Men who preferred silence. Edrin's warning returned to Aldrich like cold wind. The rival seekers had found them. Lyra's face tightened. "They know we have the fragments," or they guessed. Does it matter? Not wonderfully. The villagers debated what to do. Some wanted to hide the notes. Others wanted to scatter into the forest. A few wanted to meet. The riders with axes, which Aldrich respected emotionally, while questioning strategically. Sella listened until the arguments tangled. Then she struck her staff against a root. The sound silenced everyone. The old song was divided, so fear could not end she sighed. So we divide what we know again. Aldrich understood. Not retreat. Protection. The fragments could not remain in one pack. One notebook, one memory. Allies from every part of the journey gathered around the fire. Aldrich gave the stone phrase to Bren, who repeated it with surprising accuracy. Lyra taught the lake echo to Torin. Oswin took the performer's verse. Sella kept the forest call, a quiet village girl. Learned the archive, meaning word by word. The rhythm passed from hands tapping knees to sticks striking earth. Soon, everyone held a portion. The melody became too widely shared to steal. That was the eccentric brilliance of the old keepers. They had built safety through inconvenience. A thief could grab one scroll. A lord could imprison one singer. But stealing, a song from 20 stubborn villagers, 2 performers, a fisherman, a shepherd, and 3 judgmental sheep was a much more awkward afternoon. Night fell. Fires burned low beneath the trees. The gathered allies spoke quietly, planning routes and signals. The final piece of the melody still remained beyond them, somewhere near the sleeping castle on the western path, where Rowan had vanished. Aldrich knew they would have to go there. Not all of them, too many. People would attract attention. A smaller group would move at dawn. Aldrich, Lyra, Sella, Oswin, Torin, and Bren, though Bren insisted The sheep had already committed morally. Aldrich discouraged this. Bren looked offended on their behalf. Before sleep, Aldrich walked alone to the edge of the settlement. Moonlight filtered through branches. The forest smelled of leaves, smoke, and damp bark. He took out Rowan's notebook. The pages were worn now from use. For the first time, Aldrich felt less like he was following Rowan's trail and more like walking beside the man's unfinished hope. Had Rowan stood here? Had he believed he was close? Had he been afraid? A sound behind him made Aldrich turn. Lyra approached quietly. "You should rest. So should you." "I am pretending." "Same." She stood beside him. For a while they saw nothing. Then Aldrich spoke softly. "If Rowan failed, why should we succeed?" Lyra considered. Because Rowan was alone. The answer settled gently between them. Yes, that was the difference. Rowan had carried too much by himself. Aldrich had nearly done the same, but the melody resisted ownership. IT wanted company, annoyingly wise, for a song behind them. A settlement hummed faintly as people practiced fragments under their breath. The sound drifted through the trees like warm smoke, not loud, not polished, but alive. Aldrich closed the notebook and tucked IT away. At dawn, they would follow the western path. They would search for Rowan's final clue. They would face whoever wanted the melody buried. But tonight, Elderwood held the song in many voices. And for the first time since the journey began, the broken wings seemed almost ready to mend. Dawn arrived quietly, as though Elderwood itself did not want to wake the danger waiting beyond the western ridge. Mist hung between the trees. Birds called softly from hidden branches. The small company gathered beside the old path. Aldrich with H.I.'s lute, Lyra with her harp, Sella with her walking staff, Oswin with a satchel of performer's tricks, Torin with a fishing knife he claimed was mostly decorative, and Bren with one sheep. Aldrich stared at the animal. "I thought we discussed this." Bren nodded. "We did." And she disagreed. The sheep chewed grass with the serene confidence of someone above criticism. Nobody had the energy to argue. They traveled west beneath close branches, moving carefully through the forest. Sella ellied them along old deer paths and mossy hollows, avoiding the broader road where riders might pass. By midday they reached a ridge overlooking a meadow. Below, dark, cloaked, men moved among the trees. 6 of them, maybe more hidden beyond sight. They were searching, not rushing. That made them more dangerous. "They know we're nearby," Lyra whispered. Oswin smiled thinly. "Then we should be somewhere else." Aldrich looked toward the west. Past the meadow, faint smoke rose from a distant hollow where lantern poles had been raised. "The Feast of Lantern Lights," Sella said. Aldrich had heard of it. Once each harvest season, woodland folk from scattered settlements gathered in a hidden clearing, lighting lanterns for the living, the dead, and everyone still stubbornly lost between the two. A celebration, music, food, crowds, and now, unfortunately, enemies. They reached the feast near sunset. Hundreds of lanterns glowed between the trees, gold and amber and soft red, swaying from branches like captured stars. Tables filled with bread, fruit, roasted roots, honey cakes, and steaming pots. Fiddlers played near a fire circle. For one moment, the danger seemed far away. Then Aldrich noticed strangers at the edge of the clearing. 2, still, too watchful, too uninterested in honey cakes, which was suspicious behavior by any civilized standard. The hidden enemies had arrived. Aldrich's group split naturally into the crowd, not hiding in fear exactly, more like becoming part of the feast. Oswin began telling a ridiculous tale near the largest fire. Torin joined fishermen by the food tables. Bren's sheep became unexpectedly popular with children. Lyra found musicians near the lantern poles. Aldrich remained near the center, watching. The plan formed quickly, not through grand strategy, through instinct. They could not fight armed men, but they could confuse them. And if there was one battlefield where performers held advantage, it was a crowded feast at twilight. Oswin began first. His voice rose above the music, launching into a story about a knight who mistook a laundry basket for an enchanted helmet. Laughter spread through the crowd. People gathered closer, while the watchers turned toward him. Lyra shifted the musicians into a lively reel. Dancers joined. Lanterns swayed. The clearing filled with movement. Aldrich slipped between groups, quietly passing signals. Sella directed villagers to carry fragments of the melody in different directions. Torin loudly challenged 3 men to a fish-cleaning contest, despite having nitrogen monoxide fish. Somehow, this worked. The suspicious strangers hesitated. Their search depended on fear and separation. The feast gave them noise, warmth, and far too many witnesses. One dark-cloaked man finally approached Aldrich. "You are the bard." Aldrich smiled. "I try not to brag. You have something that belongs to my masters. Terrible news. I own very little." "The notes." Aldrich tilted his head. "Ah, you mean the song." The man's eyes narrowed. Around them, the dance continued. Music circled the clearing. Lantern light flickered across faces. "You will hand it over." The man sighed. Aldrich leaned closer. "I would, truly, but there's a practical difficulty." "What?" "I don't have IT. That was true now. Beautifully, dangerously true. The man grabbed Aldrich's cloak. The nearest dancers slowed. Bad, very bad. Then Bren's sheep charged, not far, not gracefully, but directly into the man's knees. He collapsed with a sound somewhere between anger and surprise. The crowd gasped. Then Oswin shouted, "Behold, the judgment of wool." Laughter exploded across the clearing. The tension broke. Villagers surged forward, not attacking, but surrounding. The cloaked man scrambled up, humiliated rather than injured, which was somehow worse for him. His companions moved in. Lyra struck her harp sharply. The musicians followed. Aldrich recognized the rhythm, Edrin's rhythm. Sella began. The forest call. Oswin added the performer's verse. Torin sang the lake echo badly but loudly, which still counted. Bren, to everyone's shock, carried the stone phrase in a clear voice. Around the clearing, others joined with fragments learned the night before. The Feast of Lantern Lights became a living circle of sound. The cloaked men froze, not from magic, from realization. They could not seize the melody. IT was everywhere, held by dozens of voices. Aldrich lifted his lute and wove the pieces together, not completing them, not yet, but joining enough for the clearing to understand. The song rose beneath the lanterns, warm, steady, unmistakably shared. One of the strangers backed away. Another cursed under his breath. Their leader glared at Aldrich, face red with fury and sheep-related shame. "This is not over." Aldrich nodded. "People who say that rarely bring snacks." The man spat on the ground and retreated into the trees with the others. Nobody followed. The feast remained, still for several breaths. Then, slowly, applause began. Not triumphant. Relieved, Aldrich lowered H.I.'s lute. The lanterns swayed overhead. Their tiny flames reflected in Lyra's eyes. Scylla touched the carved bird at her belt and whispered, "Now they know." "Good?" Torin asked. Scylla looked toward the dark western trees. "Necessary." Later, as the feast resumed in softer form, an elderly lantern maker approached Aldrich. She shared one eccentric custom. Lanterns in elderwood were sometimes painted inside with invisible berry wash, so when warmed by flame, hidden symbols appeared. Messages for the dead, blessings for travelers, and once, reportedly, an insult so poetic it ended a courtship instantly. She handed Aldrich a lantern. Inside, as the flame warmed a faded bird appeared, both wings nearly whole. Beneath it were 3 words, "Castle Wakes West." Aldrich showed the others. The final path had revealed itself. The hidden enemies had failed to take the melody, but they had also confirmed its importance. Beyond the feast, past the western trees, the sleeping castle waited. And under the lantern light, with laughter returning carefully around them, Aldrich understood they would have to reach it before silence did. The western path beyond the feast of lantern lights felt older than the roads Aldrich had traveled before, not simply less used, older. Roots crossed the trail like sleeping serpents. Stones jutted from the earth beneath layers of moss. The trees leaned close overhead, their branches tangled so tightly that morning sunlight entered only in thin, silver shafts. The company moved quietly. Aldrich, Lyra, Scylla, Oswin, Torin, Wren, and the sheep. Yes, still the sheep. At this point, Aldrich had stopped questioning it. Some companions joined through destiny, others through stubborn grazing habits. Stories had room for both. The lantern maker's message remained fixed in his mind. Castle Wakes West. By midday, the trees began to thin. A cold wind drifted through the gaps. Then the land dropped into a wide hollow, and there it stood, the sleeping castle. Its towers rose above the forest like broken teeth against the gray sky. Ivy covered the outer walls. One gate hung crooked from rusted hinges. No banners flew from the battlements. The castle had been abandoned for generations. Old Thales claimed it once belonged to a border lord who tried to claim both the forest roads and the hidden springs of Elderwood. Others said it was deserted after a winter siege. Scylla sighed both stories were incomplete, which was her usual way of saying everyone else was wrong, but she would reveal why only when dramatically convenient. They entered through the broken gate. Inside, the courtyard lay silent. Grass grew between paving stones. A dry fountain stood at the center, carved with figures too weathered to recognize. Lyra touched one stone face gently. Singers. She sighed. Aldrich looked closer. She was right. The fountain figures held open mouths, hands joined in a circle. The castle had not merely guarded land. it had guarded memory. They searched the outer rooms first. Most were empty. Collapsed halls, old storerooms, a chapel with cracked windows, and a roof open to the sky. In the chapel, Aldrich found another bird symbol scratched beneath the altar. This one showed the wings whole, but the head bowed. Beneath it were words nearly hidden by dust. To wake stone, sing what stone remembers. Helpful, Torin muttered. Cryptic, but helpful. Oswin nodded. Ancient messages rarely say, "Turn left after the moldy arch." Very inconsiderate. The search lead them downward. Behind the chapel, Sella discovered a stairwell hidden under fallen boards. It descended beneath the castle into darkness that smelled of cold stone and old rain. Aldrich lit a lantern. The flame trembled. They went down. The passage opened into a vaulted chamber beneath the keep. Its walls were lined with shallow niches, each holding a carved stone tablet. Many were cracked. Some lay broken on the floor. At the far end stood a sealed archway. Nitrogen monoxide door, just stone. Across its surface was carved the bird symbol, wings spread wide. Around IT circled marks Aldrich recognized from every stage of the journey. The ruin's tones, the lake's echo, the fair's verse, the hermit's rhythm, the archive words, the forest call, all gathered here. Lyra inhaled softly. This is where they meant it to be completed. Aldrich stepped closer. The archway bore one final line. No voice alone may enter. Of course. Aldrich almost smiled. The melody had been saying that from the beginning. They formed a half circle before the sealed arch. Aldrich began with the 5-note phrase from the ancient stones. Lyra entered with the lake's returned harmony. Edrin's rhythm came next, tapped by Bran and Sella on the stone floor. Oswin sang the performer's verse. Torin added his part, slightly OFF key, but with heroic confidence. Sella lifted the forest call. Then Aldrich spoke the archive words into the melody. When memory gathers, no crown owns the road, the chamber answered. A low vibration moved through the floor. Dust fell from the archway. The song continued. When voices answer, nitrogen monoxide, Lord owns the spring. The carved bird seemed almost to shift in lantern light. When promise is spoken, no hand breaks the wing. A deep sound passed through the stone. Not a crack, not collapse. A release. The sealed arch slid inward by the width of a hand, then slowly opened enough for one person to pass. Everyone stared. Torin whispered, "I take back half my complaints." Only half. Reasonable. Beyond the arch lay a small round chamber. Nitrogen monoxide treasure waited inside. No golden crown. Nitrogen monoxide sword. Nitrogen monoxide dramatic pile of jewels. Because apparently ancient memory keepers had terrible instincts for satisfying treasure hunters. Instead, the chamber held a stone bench, a dry basin, and a wall covered in writing. At the center of the wall was a final carving, the bird whole, both wings lifted. Beneath IT, carved in careful lines, was the last verse. Not long, not ornate. Aldrich read it aloud. Let every road remember the feet that made IT. Let every spring remember the hands that shared IT. Let every song remember the voices that kept IT. Let none be forgotten. While one voice remains, silence followed. SOFT, full silence. The kind that does not empty a room, but fills IT. Lyra's eyes shone. Sella bowed her head. Oswin looked unusually serious, which made him seem briefly like a different man wearing Oswin's beard. Aldrich copied the final verse slowly, carefully. His hand trembled. Once. Not from fear, from recognition. This was what Roan had sought. This was what the old keepers had hidden. Not power. Not prophecy. A promise that memory belonged to everyone. The eccentric marvel of the castle revealed itself in the chamber walls. The stones were arranged to carry joined voices into hidden hollows above, so music soon below would echo through the empty towers. A sleeping castle could truly wake not by enchantment, but by architecture designed to sing. Aldrich turned back toward the open arch. Rowan may have reached this place. Sella nodded toward the bench. There, carved faintly into the stone, was a name, Rowan. Beside it were words, scratched by a desperate hand. I could not carry it alone. Aldrich closed his eyes. For a moment, the whole journey seemed to gather around him. Brindle Hollow's silence, the ruins' wind, the lake voices, the hidden records, the children's forest calls, the feast beneath lanterns. Rowan had found the truth, but without enough voices to awaken it fully. Perhaps he had opened the chamber and understood too late that one man could not restore what was built for many. They did not find his body, nitrogen monoxide sign of his final path, only the message. That was grief enough. When they emerged into the courtyard, late sunlight broke through the clouds. Aldrich lifted his lute. Together they sang the gathered melody once more, this time complete enough to stir the castle itself. Sound rose through cracked halls and hollow towers. The stones answered. The sleeping castle woke in song. The song did not end when Aldrich lowered H.I.'s lute. It lingered, not in the ordinary way. Music lingers in memory, humming behind the ribs after the final note fades. This lingered in the stones themselves. The towers carried faint echoes from one hollow chamber to another, passing the melody through cracks, stairwells, archways, and empty rooms until the whole sleeping castle seemed to breathe. Aldrich stood in the courtyard with the others, listening. No one rushed to speak. Even the sheep remained quiet, which Bren later insisted proved the solemnity of the moment. Aldrich suspected the animal was simply chewing, but he allowed the interpretation. The complete melody had revealed itself, and yet it had not done what legends promised. Nitrogen monoxide, destiny twisted, no crown shattered. Nitrogen monoxide, hidden treasure rose from the earth. Nitrogen monoxide, dramatic beam of light shot into the heavens, which Aldrich privately found a little disappointing. After weeks of danger, riddles, and questionable tea, a modest beam would not have been unreasonable. Instead, the melody gave them something stranger, understanding. The forgotten melody was not a spell. It was not a weapon. It was not a secret meant to make one person powerful. It was a vessel, built to carry shared memory through time. A song made so nitrogen monoxide, single ruler, house, archive. Our fearful man could decide what a people were allowed to remember. Lyra sat on the edge of the dry fountain, harp resting across her knees. So all the tailies were wrong, she sighed softly. Aldrich shook his head. Not wrong? Bent? Sella nodded. That is what happens to truth when it travels hungry. Oswin sighed. And here I hoped for a curse. Curses sell beautifully. Torin looked offended. I crossed a haunted lake for public land rights. For remembered promises, Sella said. He considered this. Still good, less flashy. They laughed, quietly at first, then more freely. The sound moved through the broken courtyard like sunlight, finding old windows. Aldrich took out every note he had copied along the journey. Rowan's notebook, the archive verse, the rhythm marks, Lyra's family pages, the final castle lines. He laid them across a flat stone. Together, they reviewed the complete melody. It was not terribly long. That surprised him. After all the searching, he expected something vast and elaborate. Instead, the tune was simple enough for children to learn, but layered enough that singers could add harmony, rhythm, echo, and verse. Brilliant. Annoyingly brilliant. A song did not need to be complex to survive. It needed to be remembered. And this one had been designed for exactly that. Each person took part. Bren tapped the rhythm. Lyra played the lake harmony. Oswin shaped the spoken verse into a performance line. Sella corrected the forest call whenever anyone softened it too much. Torrin sang boldly and inaccurately until Lyra, with heroic patience, guided him toward the proper note. After the fourth attempt, he improved. After the seventh, he became dangerous with confidence. By late afternoon, the melody was whole enough to carry beyond the castle. Then hoofbeats sounded beyond the gate. Everyone turned. Dark-cloaked riders entered the courtyard slowly. Their leader, still carrying the wounded dignity of a man defeated by livestock, dismounted near the broken fountain. Behind him stood 8 armed men, more than before, his eyes fixed on Aldrich. "You found IT." Aldrich gathered the papers calmly. "Yes. Give IT to M. Nitrogen monoxide." The leader smiled without warmth. "You think a song protects you?" Aldrich looked around the courtyard, at Lyra, at Sella, at Oswin, A.T. Torrin, at Bren, at the sheep, whose expression suggested deep legal neutrality. "No," Aldrich sighed. "People do." The leader drew a blade. The air tightened. Then Sella stepped forward. "You still do not understand." She began to sing, one voice, low and steady. Lyra joined, then Oswin, then Bren, then Torrin, slightly late, but deeply committed. Aldrich added the lute. The melody rose again, but this time IT passed through the castle fully awakened. The walls gathered the sound. The towers lifted IT. Echoes multiplied above them until 5 singers became 20, then 50, then a chorus carried by stone. The hired men looked around sharply. They heard voices everywhere, from windows, from arches, from empty halls, not ghosts, architecture, memory made loud. The leader shouted for silence, which was a deeply foolish request during a song designed specifically to defeat silence. Outside the castle, more voices answered. Aldrich turned. At the broken gate stood villagers from Elderwood, dozens of them, then more. People from the lantern feast, woodcutters, gatherers, children, the elderly lantern maker. Even Lady Maren had come, supported by 2 riders bearing the Vale colors. Beside her rode Mistress Kale from the archives, looking deeply displeased with outdoor conditions. The melody spread from the castle to the crowd. Everyone carried a piece. The final purpose revealed itself not as mystery, but as action. A song becomes law again when sung publicly by those who remember IT. Lady Maren raised her voice after the final verse. House Vale renews the oath. The courtyard stilled. She spoke clearly, before witnesses from Elderwood, the archives, the roads, and the hills. The old agreements stand. The forest roads remain shared. The springs remain protected. The songs remain free. The hired leader looked suddenly smaller, not defeated by force, defeated by witnesses, by memory, by the terrible inconvenience of people knowing the truth together. Mistress Kale unrolled a document. The archive recognizes the concord of voices as valid record. Aldrich almost laughed. Bureaucracy had arrived at last, wearing sensible shoes and carrying doom in parchment form. The cloaked men withdrew. They had nitrogen monoxide battle left to fight. Not here. Not before so many. Not against a song now held by hundreds. As evening settled, lanterns were lit across the ruined courtyard. Someone brought bread. Someone else brought cider. Oswin began retelling the confrontation with enough exaggeration to make the sheep sound nearly royal. Bren approved. Aldrich stood apart for a moment, Rowan's notebook in hand. He touched the carved words on the stone bench once more. I could not carry IT alone. No, Aldrich whispered, but you carried IT far enough. The melody had not changed fate by magic. IT had changed people by returning what fear had hidden. That was quieter, stronger, and far more difficult to bury. As the complete song rose beneath the evening sky, Aldrich finally understood why IT had called to him beyond Elderwood. Not because he was chosen, because he had listened. And sometimes that was enough to begin mending a broken wing. By the next morning, the sleeping castle nitrogen monoxide longer fell asleep. IT remained ruined. Of course, the walls still leaned, IVY still claimed the towers, rain would still enter several chambers, with the confidence of an invited guest. But something had changed. Voices moved through the courtyard. People swept stone paths. Children explored under careful supervision. Villagers hung lanterns from broken arches. Lady Mirren's riders raised new markers along the old road, while Mistress Kale sat at a portable table, writing official copies with the expression of someone personally offended by wind. Aldrich watched IT. All. From the chapel steps, Lyra sat beside him, quietly tuning her harp. You look peaceful, she sighed. That seems unlikely. Less confused, then? I will accept less confused. Below them, Sella taught a group of children the forest call. Bren demonstrated the rhythm using 2 sticks. Torin attempted harmony, and was gently redirected by everyone within hearing distance. Oswin had already begun shaping the whole adventure into a grand tale. In his version, Aldrich had stared down 20 armed men. Lyra had summoned echoes from the moon, and the sheep had acted with noble tactical brilliance. Aldrich objected only to the number 20. The sheep's role, regrettably, had evidence. By midday, the complete melody was sung again before witnesses, not as a secret, not as a discovery, as a restoration. House Vale renewed the oath publicly. Elderwood's elders answered. The archive copies were sealed. The road rights, spring protections, and old promises became known once more, no longer hidden in cabinets, stones, our half-remembered songs. The eccentric little truth of the day was this. In many places, a promise spoken before enough witnesses mattered almost as much as a written charter. Memory itself became a kind of seal. And if the witnesses included villagers, nobles, performers, archivists, children, and one unusually influential sheep, well, that was practically unbreakable. When the ceremony ended, Aldrich carried Rowan's notebook to the round chamber beneath the castle. He was alone for a while. The carved words still waited. On the bench, I could not carry IT alone. Aldrich placed a fresh copy of the completed melody beside the inscription, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed inside a small wooden case. You were right, he sighed softly. It needed more than one voice. He stayed there until the lantern burned low. Then he returned to the courtyard. That evening, Everyone gathered beneath the open sky. No grand feast had been planned, which naturally meant one happened anyway. Food appeared. Music started. Someone found cider. Oswin told stories. Children danced between lanterns. Aldrich finally played for nitrogen monoxide. Mystery, nitrogen monoxide, clue. Nitrogen monoxide, urgent purpose. Just music. Light, warm, familiar music. The kind meant for tired feet and full hearts. Lyra joined him, then others. The complete melody came last. This time, I did not feel ancient and heavy. I felt alive, carried by voices that knew what I meant. As stars appeared above, the broken towers, Aldrich understood that he would leave again someday. Bards wandered, roads called, new villages waited with new songs, new debts, and probably new goats with administrative authority. But Elderwood would not lose the melody now. Too many new IT. Too many children were already humming it incorrectly, which was annoying and perfect. Songs survived by being soon, not flawlessly, faithfully. Days later, Aldrich returned beneath the familiar branches of Elderwood. He was not the same man who had left chasing a rumor. He carried fewer questions now, though plenty remained. A sensible amount of mystery was healthy. Too little mystery made life taste like unsalted porridge. Villagers greeted him with warmth. The gloomy silence of Brindle Hollow had begun to lift after news reached them. Lady Marin sent coin to settle Rowan's old bakery debt. With interest, the baker reportedly wept, then immediately complained the interest calculation was too modest. That felt right. In the seasons that followed, the melody spread, not as rebellion, not as threat, as remembrance. Travelers carried IT along roads. Children sang IT between trees. Performers wove IT into stories. Archives copied IT properly. And at the sleeping castle, once each year, people gathered to sing beneath lantern light while the towers answered in many voices. As for Aldrich, he remained a wandering bard. But now, wherever he traveled, he listened more carefully to old women humming near springs, to shepherds tapping rhythms on fence posts, to children inventing nonsense songs, to ruins murmuring in wind. He had learned that history did not always sit in royal halls wearing clean robes. Sometimes IT wore muddy boots. Sometimes IT hid in jokes. Sometimes IT waited inside a tune nobody thought important enough to write down. And sometimes, if a person was curious, E-N-O-U-G-H, foolish, E-N-O-U-G-H, and lucky enough to follow a sound through misty roads, forgotten villages, moonlit lakes, thorny hills, locked archives, and broken castles, a lost song might become a living promise again. Years later, when Aldrich's hair had begun to silver at the temples, people still asked whether the forgotten melody had truly changed destiny. He always smiled at that. Then he answered the same way. It changed what people remembered. That is usually where destiny starts. And somewhere in Elderwood, beneath branches that swayed softly in the evening wind, children sang the mended song without fear, their voices rising together through leaves, roots, stone, and story. The wing was whole. The road was shared. The spring was protected. And while one voice remained, none would be forgotten. Now the night grows softer around the edges. The long road settles behind him, quiet beneath the stars and the forest nitrogen monoxide. Longer feels like a place of riddles, but a place of shelter. The branches above Elderwood move slowly in the dark. as though the trees are breathing in their sleep. Aldrich rests beside a small fire, his lute wrapped safely in cloth. Rowan's notebook closed at last, and the completed melody carried not in one hand, but in many hearts. There is nitrogen monoxide. Need to hurry now. Nitrogen monoxide riders in the distance. Nitrogen monoxide locked doors. Nitrogen monoxide forgotten. Promise waiting in the cold. Only the gentle sound of leaves. Only the hush of old stones cooling beneath moonlight. Only the memory of voices joined together, warm and steady, reminding every road, every spring, every home, and every wandering soul that they belong somewhere. And perhaps that is the kindest ending a tale can offer. Not a crown, not a treasure chest, not a spell, bright enough to frighten the clouds. Just a song remembered, a promise kept. A tired traveler, finally allowed to close his eyes beneath familiar branches. So let your own thoughts grow quiet now. Let the day loosen its grip. Let every worry drift a little farther away, like lanterns floating gently down a dark river. The fire burns low. The forest keeps watch, and Elderwood dreams in peace.